Picture a small metal trowel no longer than your hand, its wooden handle worn smooth from 1,000 afternoons in the dirt, the blade scratched and dull. Nothing special about it at all. And yet that little tool helped feed 20 million American families during the war. It wasn't shipped overseas. It wasn't forged in a factory for soldiers. It lived in backyards, on apartment balconies, in empty city lots. And in the hands of ordinary people, it became something else entirely, a quiet weapon against hunger. But here's what most folks never knew. The government didn't just suggest you plant a garden. They tracked it. They counted it. They built an entire system around those little shovels and hoes, turning neighborhood dirt into a national strategy. So how did a simple hand tool end up controlling what millions of Americans ate? What made a rake or a spade feel like a duty instead of a choice? And what happened to the families who couldn't afford even that? Those answers, they're buried just beneath the surface. They called them victory gardens. Maybe you remember them. Maybe your mother had one, or your grandmother. A patch of tomatoes behind the house, beans climbing up a wooden frame, lettuce in neat rows. But the tools that made those gardens possible, the spades, the hoes, the hand rakes, the trowels, they weren't just tools. They were lifelines. By 1943, nearly 20 million American families were growing their own food at home, and every single one of them needed something to dig with, something to turn the soil, something to pull weeds and harvest vegetables when the time came. Victory garden tools were simple things: a wooden handle, a metal blade, nothing fancy, nothing you'd look at twice in a hardware store before the war. But during those years, between 1942 and 1945, those tools carried a weight that went far beyond their size. They represented control, not over nations or armies, but over something even more important: your family's next meal. Can you imagine opening your kitchen cupboard and knowing that what you'd eat that week depended entirely on what you could grow yourself? It wasn't romantic. It wasn't optional for many. It was survival, one shovelful of dirt at a time. And the story of how these tools came to matter so much, well, that begins long before the first seed was ever planted. The idea didn't start in 1941. Victory gardens had roots, you might say, that reached all the way back to World War I. Back then, they called them Liberty Gardens. The government asked Americans to grow food at home so more could be shipped to soldiers overseas, and people did, millions of them. But when that war ended, the gardens disappeared. People went back to buying what they needed. The tools went into sheds and basements, forgotten. Then December 7th, 1941 happened. Everything changed overnight. Within months, the United States was fighting on two fronts: Europe and the Pacific. Food production had to shift. Massive amounts of canned goods, dried meat, flour, and vegetables were being packed into crates and loaded onto ships bound for soldiers who needed them more than anyone. That left less for the folks back home. The government knew it. And they knew something else, too. If they rationed food too harshly without offering people a way to help themselves, panic would spread. Fear. Anger. So in early 1942, the War Department and the Department of Agriculture came together with a plan. They would ask Americans to plant gardens, lots of them, everywhere they could. But asking wasn't enough. They had to make it feel like a duty, a contribution, something you did because it mattered, because your neighbor was doing it, because the country was counting on you. The campaign launched in the spring of 1942. Posters went up in post offices, schools, shop windows. Radio broadcasts reminded families that every tomato they grew was one more can that could go to a soldier. Newspapers printed planting guides. Community groups organized seed swaps. And at the center of it all were the tools. The problem was, not everyone had them. Before the war, most folks in cities didn't own a hoe or a spade. Why would they? They bought their vegetables at the market. But now, with metal being rationed for the war effort, tool production slowed. Factories that once made rakes were now making rifle parts. So the government got creative. They urged people to borrow tools from neighbors, share them, pass them from yard to yard. In some cities, community tool libraries opened, places where you could check out a shovel the way you'd check out a book. Still, there was confusion at first. People didn't know what to plant, or when, or how deep. They didn't know if their soil was good enough or if they had enough sunlight. Some folks tried and failed that first season, watching their seedlings wither in the heat or drown in too much rain. But by the summer of 1943, something remarkable had happened. Americans had planted over 20 million victory gardens. In backyards, on rooftops, in empty lots between buildings, even in public parks, where the city gave families small plots to tend. And every single one of those gardens started the same way, with a tool in hand and dirt under fingernails. But the real story, the one that shaped how people ate, how they felt, how they survived those years, that story was just beginning to unfold. Imagine it's a Saturday morning in June 1943. You wake up early before the heat sets in. The house is quiet. You pull on an old pair of trousers, maybe a cotton shirt that's seen better days. You step into the backyard, and there it is, your victory garden. It's not much, maybe 20 feet by 15. Rows of tomatoes, beans climbing up stakes, a patch of lettuce starting to bolt in the warmth, carrots buried somewhere under the soil, their green tops poking through. You pick up your spade. The wooden handle is smooth now, worn down by your grip. The blade catches the early light, still damp from the dew. You kneel down. You press the blade into the earth. You turn the soil, pulling up weeds that tried to take root overnight. It's slow work, quiet work. There's a rhythm to it. Dig, turn, pull, dig, turn, pull. Your hands get dirty. Your knees ache a little. But there's something calming about it, too. You're not thinking about ration stamps or meatless Tuesdays or the news from Europe. You're just here, in this small patch of ground, doing something that feels solid and real. Can you remember that feeling? For millions of Americans, this became the routine. Morning or evening, whenever there was time, they'd go out to their gardens, they'd check the plants, water them if the rain hadn't come, pull a tomato off the vine and feel its weight in their hand. The tools were simple, but they had to be cared for. You'd wipe the blade clean after every use. Some folks rubbed a little oil on the metal to keep it from rusting. Handles got sanded down when splinters appeared. If a tool broke, a cracked handle, a bent blade, you didn't throw it away. You fixed it, or you traded it to someone who could, because you couldn't just go buy a new one. Metal was scarce. Factories were busy. And even if you found a hardware store with tools in stock, they weren't cheap. A decent spade might cost you $1 or more, money that many families didn't have to spare. So people got creative. Some carved their own handles from scrap wood. Others fashioned makeshift hoes from old broom handles and bent metal scraps. Kids used tin cans with the tops cut off to dig small holes for seedlings. It wasn't about having the best tools. It was about having something, anything that worked. And the gardens themselves? They became a strange kind of currency. If you grew more than you could eat, you traded. Your neighbor's cucumbers for your green beans. Someone's extra zucchini for a handful of your tomatoes. In apartment buildings, families on different floors swapped produce like they were running their own little markets. The tools moved between hands, too. A woman in Chicago might lend her trowel to the elderly man next door so he could plant his lettuce. A father in Detroit might borrow a hoe from a co-worker to turn over a patch of soil in his yard. There was a tenderness to it, a kind of unspoken agreement. We're all in this together. But it wasn't always easy. Some folks struggled. The soil in their yard was too rocky, too hard-packed. They didn't have enough sun, or they had too much. The tools they managed to find were old, rusted, barely functional. And for families already stretched thin, working long hours in factories, raising children alone while fathers were overseas, the garden felt like one more thing on an endless list of obligations. Still they tried, because the alternative was going without. By the summer of 1943, Victory Gardens across America were producing nearly 10 million tons of vegetables. That was more than 40% of all the fresh produce consumed in the country that year. 10 million tons, all of it grown by hand. All of it started with a small metal blade pressed into the earth. But not everyone's garden looked the same, and not everyone had the same tools to work with. That's where the story starts to shift. Here's something the posters didn't show. Not every family could afford a spade. Not every neighborhood had a hardware store. And not every patch of ground was worth planting. In wealthier parts of town, Victory Gardens looked almost elegant. Neat rows, good soil enriched with compost, quality tools, sometimes even new ones, purchased before the shortages hit. Families had space, they had time, they had help. But in poorer neighborhoods, it was different. The soil was harder, rockier. In some industrial areas, the ground was so contaminated from years of factory runoff that nothing would grow right. Families didn't have big backyards. They had narrow strips of dirt behind tenement buildings, or nothing at all. And the tools? When you could find them, they cost money people didn't have. A single hand trowel might be 50 cents. A hoe, $1 or more. For a family already skipping meals to make the ration stamps last, that was a fortune. So they made do. Some folks used kitchen spoons to dig. Others bent old forks into makeshift rakes. Kids scavenged scrap metal from junkyards and tried to fashion blades that could cut through soil. It worked sometimes, but not always. And then there was the other side of the story, the one people didn't like to talk about. The black market for tools. It wasn't widespread, not like the black market for ration stamps or gasoline. But it existed. In some cities, men would buy up tools from hardware stores before shortages hit, then resell them at 2 or 3 times the price. A spade that should have cost $1 might go for $3. A set of garden tools, trowel, hoe, rake, could run you $10 or more if you were desperate enough. Some families paid it. They had no choice. Others refused. They borrowed. They begged. They went without. Can you imagine needing something so simple, a metal blade, a wooden handle, and not being able to get it? There was shame in that for some people, a quiet kind of shame. Because the government was telling you to plant a garden. Your neighbors were planting. The posters made it look easy, patriotic, necessary. And if you couldn't do it, if you didn't have the tools or the space or the time, it felt like failure. But it wasn't failure. It was circumstance. And yet the pressure was real. Community groups kept track of who had a garden and who didn't. In some neighborhoods, block captains would go door to door asking why your yard wasn't planted yet. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to encourage. But for families already struggling, it felt like judgment. And the strangest part, the vegetables you grew weren't just for you. In some communities, there were harvest quotas. Informal ones mostly, but if you grew more than your family could eat, you were expected to donate the surplus to community kitchens, to churches, to relief organizations. It made sense in a way. The whole point of Victory Gardens was to ease the burden on the national food supply. Sharing the harvest was part of that. But it also meant that the little tool in your hand, the one you'd scraped together money to buy, or borrowed from a neighbor, or fashioned from scrap metal, wasn't just feeding your family. It was feeding everyone. And that weight, that responsibility, it sat heavy on a lot of shoulders. Still, people kept planting, kept digging, kept trying. Because what else could they do? But there was a moment, one particular moment, when everything seemed like it might fall apart. It happened in the summer of 1944. By then, the war had been grinding on for nearly 3 years. People were tired. Ration stamps had become a way of life, but that didn't make them easier. Meatless days, sugarless weeks. The constant uncertainty of what would be available at the store. Victory Gardens had helped. They'd kept families fed when the cupboards were bare. But they required something people were running out of. Energy. And then the rains came. In the Midwest, it rained for weeks. Fields flooded, backyard gardens turned to mud. The soil became so waterlogged that roots rotted before they could take hold. Tomatoes split on the vine. Beans drowned. Entire plots were washed away. In the South, it was the opposite. A brutal drought. The ground cracked open. Plants withered in the heat. Families tried to water their gardens by hand, hauling buckets from wells or spigots, but it wasn't enough. And in the cities, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. Tool shortages were getting worse. Factories were still focused on the war effort. The metal that might have gone into spades and hoes was going into ammunition and vehicle parts. Hardware stores had empty shelves. Community tool libraries were running out of equipment to lend. People tried to make their old tools last, but everything has a breaking point. Handles snapped, blades bent and couldn't be straightened. And without a way to fix them, without metal, without replacement parts, gardens started to fail. Imagine this. It's late July 1944. You're a woman in your 30s living in a small house in Ohio. Your husband is overseas, somewhere in France. You don't know exactly where. His letters are weeks old by the time they reach you. You've been tending your Victory Garden since the spring. It's not much, but it's kept you and your 2 children fed through the summer. Fresh tomatoes, green beans, a handful of carrots, but yesterday your spade broke. You were turning the soil to plant a second crop of lettuce, something to carry you into the fall, and the handle just snapped in half. The wood had been weak for months, splintering a little more each time you used it. You'd been careful. You'd tried to baby it along. But it's gone now. You go to the hardware store. The owner shakes his head before you even ask. No tools. Won't be any for weeks, maybe months. You ask your neighbors. Everyone's in the same situation. Their tools are just as worn, just as fragile. You try to fashion a new handle from a piece of wood in your shed, but you don't have the right tools to shape it. And even if you did, the blade is bent now, nearly useless. So you kneel in the dirt and try to dig with your hands. The soil is hard. Your fingernails crack. Your knuckles bleed a little. You manage to plant half the lettuce seeds before your hands are too sore to continue. That night you sit at the kitchen table and cry. Not because of the spade, but because of everything the spade represented. Control. Contribution. The feeling that you were doing something, anything, to help while the world was falling apart. And now that small sense of control is gone. Can you imagine that moment? Across the country, thousands of families were facing the same crisis. Tools breaking, gardens failing, the weight of it all pressing down. But then something shifted. Communities started to come together in a different way. The answer came quietly, the way most solutions did during those years. It didn't come from the government or from factories or from some grand new policy. It came from neighbors helping neighbors. In small towns and big cities alike, people started organizing tool repair workshops. Someone who knew metalwork would set up in their garage or basement, and folks would bring their broken spades, their bent hoes, their cracked handles. Sometimes they could fix them. Sometimes they couldn't. But just trying felt like something. Churches and community centers began collecting tools, old ones, forgotten ones, donated ones, and redistributing them to families who needed them most. A widow with 3 children might get a spade that had been sitting unused in someone's shed. A factory worker might find a hoe at the church swap that was better than the makeshift tool he'd been using. It wasn't perfect. There still weren't enough tools to go around, but people shared what they had. And slowly, the gardens recovered. The rains in the Midwest stopped. The drought in the South broke. Families replanted what had been lost. They dug with whatever tools they could find, sometimes good ones, sometimes barely functional, and kept going. By the fall of 1944, Victory Gardens were still producing millions of tons of food, less than the year before, maybe. But still enough, still feeding families who would have gone without otherwise. And the tools, they kept moving from hand to hand, from yard to yard, from season to season. That woman in Ohio, the one whose spade had broken, she borrowed a trowel from the elderly couple down the street. It wasn't ideal for turning soil, but it worked well enough to finish planting her lettuce. By October, she was harvesting again, and when she didn't need the trowel anymore, she passed it along to someone else. That's how they survived, not by having everything they needed, but by sharing what little they had. The tools themselves became something more than metal and wood. They became symbols of resilience, of community, of the quiet determination that kept people going even when everything felt impossible. By the spring of 1945, the war was winding down. Victory in Europe came in May. Victory in Japan followed in August. And slowly, life started to return to something like normal. But the gardens and the tools that made them possible didn't disappear right away. Not yet. When the war ended, the government stopped promoting Victory Gardens. The posters came down. The radio broadcasts stopped. Factories shifted back to peacetime production. And suddenly, the stores were full again. Meat, sugar, canned goods, fresh vegetables shipped in from farms across the country. You could buy what you needed now. You didn't have to grow it. And for a lot of people, that was a relief. Tending a garden had been hard work, necessary work, but exhausting. After years of rationing, of making do, of stretching every resource as far as it would go, folks were ready to rest. So the gardens began to shrink. Some families kept theirs going for a while. They'd gotten used to the rhythm of it, the planting, the watering, the harvesting. And there was something satisfying about eating a tomato you'd grown yourself, still warm from the sun. But others let their plots go fallow. The tools went back into sheds. The soil grew over with weeds. By 1946, the number of Victory Gardens had dropped from 20 million to just a few million. By 1950, most were gone. But the tools remained. You might still find them today, tucked away in old garages or basements. A rusted spade with a worn wooden handle, a hand trowel with someone's initials scratched into the metal, a hoe that's been sitting unused for decades, the blade dull but still solid. If you're old enough, maybe you remember using one. Maybe you remember the weight of it in your hand, the way the handle felt after an hour of digging, the satisfaction of pulling a carrot from the ground, brushing off the dirt, and knowing it was yours. Or maybe you remember watching your mother or your grandmother working in the garden on a summer evening. The light slanting low through the trees, the smell of tomato plants and turned earth. Those memories, they're tied to those tools in ways that are hard to put into words. Because the tools weren't just about food. They were about survival, yes. But they were also about purpose, about feeling like you had some control during a time when so much felt out of control. And for the generation that lived through the war, that feeling never quite went away. Even decades later, many older Americans kept gardens, not because they had to, but because it reminded them of something important. It reminded them that they'd made it through, that they'd done their part, even in small ways, even with simple tools and patches of dirt that didn't look like much. And maybe it reminded them of the kindness too, the neighbors who shared tools, the communities that came together when times were hard, the brusund, quiet, unglamorous work of just keeping going, one day at a time. Victory Garden tools didn't win the war, but they helped people survive it. And in the years after, when the world was trying to rebuild itself, those tools and the memories they carried became a kind of comfort. A reminder that ordinary people with ordinary things can do extraordinary work when they have to. There's a strange poetry to it, isn't there? A metal blade, a wooden handle, something you could hold in one hand. It doesn't look like much. It never did. But during those years, 1942, 43, 44, 45, that little tool meant everything. It meant you could feed your children when the ration stamps ran out. It meant you had something to do with your hands when the worry got too heavy. It meant you were contributing, even if you never saw the front lines, even if you never wore a uniform. It meant you weren't helpless, and maybe that's the real story here. Not about the tools themselves, but about what they represented. Hope, resilience, the stubborn, quiet belief that you could make something grow, even in the hardest soil, even in the hardest times. The generation that used those tools is mostly gone now, but the lessons they left behind about community, about making do, about the dignity of simple work, those lessons are still here, still buried like seeds, waiting to be remembered. If you ever find one of those old tools, rusted, worn, forgotten in a corner somewhere, take a moment with it. Feel the weight of it. Imagine the hands that held it before yours. And remember what it meant, not just to grow food, but to grow hope, one small patch of earth at a time.